Continuing our reading in the World and Thorinn by Damon Knight. Today is Chapter 11, Section 3. Thornton untied the neck of the bladder and looked at it glumly. The inside of it was moist to the touch, although it had been dry before. Had the smoke turned to water when it cooled? Then all of the children wanted to feel the bladder too. One of them tugged at his arm and spoke earnestly. "He says the fire should be attached to the bladder, then the bladder will keep going up," said the box. Thornton opened his mouth, then closed it again. With a charred twig he sketched on the side of a stone, while the children clustered around him to watch. Here the bladder, here the ring to hold the neck open, and here, suspended from the ring, a basket for the rider. Now inside the basket a fire pot lined with clay or earth. The fire ascends with the bladder, and as long as it burns, the smoke cannot cool and turn to water. Therefore, the bladder stays aloft. But the basket can only carry so much wood to burn. When that is gone, down comes the bladder. Thornton fed more twigs to the fire to keep it going out of the light drizzle. The air shimmered over the embers. Flakes of white ash rose, wavered, and fell. Yet there was no wind. Thornton struggled with the thought. Suppose it was not the smoke at all, but the air heated by the fire that made the bladder rise. At all events, he must begin to plan now for a bladder big enough to carry him and his possessions. How big must it be? The box was of no use. "That depends on the weight of the bladder and the lifting power of the air." When Thornton asked what the lifting power of the air was, the box replied, "That depends on how hot it is and how hot the air around the bladder is." "How am I to find that out?" The box showed him a picture of a slender rod of glass with marks on it and a thread of a silver inside. "This is an engine for measuring how hot a thing is." "But where am I to get such an engine?" "I don't know, Thornton." So it was evident that he must do it himself, and in truth, he was rather glad of it, for when he asked the box's advice it always told him more than he wanted to know and more than he could understand, whereas when he worked a thing out for himself, no matter how difficult it was, at least when he was done, he understood it. That afternoon he made weights by cutting a stick into little pieces of equal length, and by attaching one after another to the neck of the bladder, determined how much it could lift when it was filled with the hot air. He also found out by accident that he could measure equally well and much more easily by attaching a long cord to the bladder. Then it rose until the lifting power of the air inside it exactly matched the weight of the cord which it raised from the ground. From these studies, Thornton concluded that the height of the bladder ought to be at least 8 times his own height in order to bear him and his belongings aloft. That meant a bladder 16 or 17 ells tall, much bigger than he had imagined it would be. He was tempted to make it smaller and therefore easier, but if it did not raise him, the work would be all for nothing. Because the bladder must bear its own weight as well as his, he wanted to make it as light as possible, and for this reason, he gave up his intention of making it out of pieces of leather or cloth. Instead, he pieced it together out of the thin, parchment-like stuff the wing people used for interior walls and screens. Aided by Sven and Ingi, he cleared a space in one of the largest workshops and took what he needed. Presently, the wing people brought more wall stuff to replace what had been taken. When he needed more, he took that as well. One morning, he came upon Sven and Ingi in the workshop trying clumsily to fit a whittled stick into the hollow of a reed. Between amusement and sympathy, Thornton explained to them through the box that both shaft and plunger must be perfectly round or the fire stick would not work. Their gray, furred little faces were so earnest and trusting that he could not leave it at that, although he was impatient to get on with his own task. He found a good rod of hard wood in the wingman's stores. For a plunger, and showed them how the shaft must be made in two halves, carved to fit around it, then slowly tightened as the plunger was turned between them with wet sand to grind the pieces to a perfect fit, and finally glued together with an end piece shaped to leave a hollow for the tinder. He left them toiling earnestly and clumsily at the task. He doubted they could accomplish it, but at least they were happy in trying. He made his bladder in 6 sections shaped like a fish, each 20 ells long and 9 ells wide. Under his direction, the children joined the pieces that made up each section with fish glue and held the sections up to dry in the well. When that was done, Thornton brought the sections back into his workroom, which in the meantime the wing people had begun to use again for their own purposes. He cleared out their benches, jars, and other rubbish, spread the sections on the floor, and began gluing the edges together. It proved exasperatingly difficult to make the flat pieces form a round shape without wrinkling or buckling, but after many failures he got the whole bladder assembled. He painted it over with fish glue, dried it again, and at last carried it outside for trial. Children trooped out after him. It was a still gray day. Thornton unfolded the bladder and hung it from a cord stretched between 2 trees, with the neck about 3 ells from the ground. He made a ring of bent saplings and secured it inside the neck. Beneath it, he laid dry brush and branches in crisscross layers and kindled a fire. Flames curled up, smoke poured into the open neck of the bladder, and presently it began to fill. To Thornton's disgust, a moment later there came a patter of raindrops in the trees and on the suspended limb bulk of the bladder. A gust of wind blew sparks slanting away from the fire. Then the patter increased to a stuttering roar. Water swept across the clearing in veils and torrents. Thornton retreated to shelter until the rain stopped. By that time, the fire was out. And that's the end of section 3.